In July 1976, over 100 civilians were sitting on a concrete floor in Uganda, already separated for death, while the country that vowed to protect them was 4,000 kilometers away. The old terminal building at Entebbe Airport had become a prison. Armed Ugandan soldiers stood guard outside. Inside, hijackers paced between rows of exhausted hostages. Israelis, Jews, families with children waiting for a deadline that would decide whether they lived or died. So how did Israel know exactly where to strike in a country that wanted them dead? How did Israel's Mossad reconstruct a foreign airport they couldn't see inside a country that wanted them dead? And why did a single black Mercedes decide who lived and who didn't? This wasn't a rescue anyone believed was possible. The Israeli government was divided. Military officers calculated the odds and found them grim. The world waited, expecting either surrender or massacre. To understand how this rescue succeeded, we have to go back to the hijacking no one thought would end in survival. In July 1976, Air France Flight 139 lifted off from Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. It was an Airbus, a 300, carrying 248 passengers and 12 crew members, families heading to Paris for summer vacation, elderly travelers, children, tourists, a routine flight with a scheduled stopover in Athens. No one suspected what was waiting. This was the 1972nd, the golden age of airline hijackings. Palestinian militant groups had discovered that hijacked planes made international headlines and created leverage. Hostages could be exchanged for imprisoned fighters. Governments could be pressured. The world could be forced to watch. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, particularly its external operations wing led by Wadi Haddad, had perfected this strategy. In 1970, they hijacked multiple planes to Dawson's Field in Jordan, blowing them up on the tarmac after releasing passengers. The images circled the globe, and Europe's airline security was fragile, easy to penetrate, easy to exploit. When Flight 139 landed in Athens for its scheduled stop, 4 people boarded the plane. 2 were Palestinian militants from the PFLP. 2 were German extremists from a group called Revolutionary Cells, a left-wing organization that saw Palestinian liberation as part of a global revolutionary struggle. The chilling irony would become impossible to ignore. Germans selecting Jews for death. Shortly after takeoff from Athens, the 4 hijackers revealed themselves. Pistols, grenades, explosives. The plane was theirs. Passengers were ordered to remain calm. The crew was instructed to change course. The plane turned south. First stop, Benghazi, Libya. A 7-hour refueling stop. 1 passenger, Patricia Martel, a British-Israeli woman, feigned a miscarriage and was released. She would later provide crucial early intelligence to MI6 and Mossad, identifying hijackers from photographs. Then the plane flew south again, far south. On the 28th of June, 1976, at 3:15 inches the afternoon, Air France Flight 139 landed at Entebbe Airport in Uganda. Of all places on earth, the plane landed in the worst one possible. Uganda was ruled by Idi Amin, a brutal dictator who had seized power in a 1971 coup, publicly anti-Israel, openly aligned with Arab causes and Palestinian militant groups. A man who had once been friendly with Israel, Israeli forces had even trained his military, and Israeli engineers had built the very airport where the hijacked plane now sat. But that relationship had collapsed. Amin had demanded weapons and support Israel wouldn't provide, so he turned against them, expelled Israeli advisors in 1972, and embraced Israel's enemies. Now, the hijackers had delivered hostages directly into his hands, and Amin welcomed them. Ugandan soldiers took up positions around the old terminal building. The hijackers weren't isolated. They were reinforced. 3 additional terrorists joined them, bringing the total to 7. The hostages were moved inside the old terminal, a dirty, neglected structure where they sat on concrete floors, surrounded by armed guards. This was no longer a hijacking in neutral territory. This was a hostage crisis inside a hostile nation, protected by a dictator's army. Then came the moment that changed everything. Within days, the hijackers began separating the hostages. Israelis and Jews on one side, non-Jews on the other. The process was methodical. Passports were checked. Names were called out. Jewish-sounding names. Israeli citizens. Even ultra-Orthodox couples from the United States and Belgium were placed with the Jewish group. Survivors later recalled the cold efficiency of it. One hijacker, Wilfried Bose, reportedly protested when he saw a Holocaust survivor's tattoo, saying he was no Nazi, that he was an idealist. But the separation continued. The non-Jewish hostages were gradually released. 47 vulnerable passengers on June 30, then 100 more on July 1. Over 100 hostages remained, almost all of them Israeli or Jewish. This wasn't negotiation anymore. This was a historical signal. For Israel, the echo was unmistakable. Germans calling out Jewish names. Selection, separation, execution was not a bluff. Israel faced an intelligence nightmare. The hostages were 4,000 kilometers away, inside a country openly hostile to Israel, guarded by soldiers loyal to a dictator who supported the hijackers. There were no drones in 1976, no live surveillance satellites with real-time feeds, no friendly government nearby offering cooperation, no Israeli embassy in Uganda. Those ties had been severed years earlier. Israel was blind. The Israeli government needed answers to impossible questions. Where exactly were the hostages inside the terminal? How many hijackers were there? What were their routines? Where were the Ugandan guards positioned? What time did patrols change? What were the lighting conditions at night? Without this information, any rescue attempt would be suicide. But Mossad doesn't accept blindness. The intelligence operation that followed is one of the most remarkable and often underplayed aspects of Operation Entebbe. Mossad began with a strange advantage. Years earlier, an Israeli construction company called Solel Boneh had built Entebbe Airport. Former Israeli engineers who had worked on the project were located and debriefed. They provided blueprints, layout diagrams, structural details, the exact dimensions of the old terminal building. But blueprints don't tell you where hostages are sitting. They don't reveal guard positions or hijacker movements. For that, Mossad turned to the released hostages. As soon as non-Jewish passengers arrived in Paris, Israeli intelligence officers were waiting. Debriefings began immediately. Every detail mattered. Where did you sit? Where were the hijackers standing? How many Ugandan soldiers did you see? What time did they change shifts? Were there lights on at night? What did the hijackers say? From these fragmented memories, Mossad began reconstructing the battlefield. One hostage remembered the exact position of a guard near the doorway. Another recalled that the hijackers slept in shifts. A third noted that the terminal lights were dim after midnight. Human intelligence networks across Africa provided additional fragments. Contacts in Kenya, sources in neighboring countries, whispers from Ugandan dissidents. Piece by piece, the picture emerged. Mossad's analysts worked around the clock, cross-referencing testimonies, comparing details, building a mental map of a place they couldn't see. By July 1, they had reconstructed the terminal's interior layout, the location of hostages within the building, hijacker routines and patrol patterns, guard positions and shift changes, and even the lighting conditions inside and outside the terminal. This intelligence made the rescue possible. Without it, the mission would have been blind. But intelligence alone wouldn't save them, because the timeline was collapsing. The hijackers had issued clear demands: release 53 imprisoned militants held in Israel and other countries, and deliver $5 million. If the demands weren't met, hostages would be executed. A deadline was set for July 1. Negotiations brought a brief extension until July 4. Inside the Israeli government, the debate was brutal. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin leaned toward negotiation. Releasing prisoners was painful, but losing over 100 civilians to execution was unthinkable. The political cost of refusing could be catastrophic. Defense Minister Shimon Peres opposed surrender. He argued that giving in would only invite future hijackings. Every terrorist group in the world would see that Israel could be pressured. The cycle would never end. Cabinet meetings stretched into the night. Handwritten notes from those sessions, later declassified, reveal the anguish. Rabin questioned whether a military operation was even feasible. Peres pushed for action, but acknowledged the intelligence was incomplete. The military was divided as well. Some officers calculated the odds and concluded the mission was nearly suicidal. Others believed that doing nothing guaranteed death. Mossad delivered its assessment. Delay equals death. The hijackers had already demonstrated ideological extremism. The separation of Jews was a red line. Execution deadlines were real. If Israel waited, hostages would die. The window for action was closing. Israeli military planners began working on something unprecedented. The plan was as audacious as it was terrifying. Fly 4C, 130 Hercules, transport planes over 4,000 kilometers, mostly over hostile or neutral territory. Fly low to avoid radar detection. Land at Entebbe airport without clearance. At night, in a country whose military had been trained by Israel and knew Israeli tactics. Drive directly to the terminal building. Storm the building. Kill the hijackers. Free the hostages. Load everyone onto the planes. Destroy any Ugandan aircraft on the ground to prevent pursuit. And escape all within 60 minutes. If the mission took longer than an hour, Ugandan MiG fighter jets could scramble and destroy the Israeli planes. If the element of surprise was lost, Ugandan soldiers would overwhelm the small Israeli force. If hostages were caught in crossfire, the mission would become a massacre. The entire operation depended on speed, precision, and luck. One critical problem remained: refueling. The Cone, 130 seconds, didn't have the range to fly to Uganda and back without refueling. They needed a friendly country to allow them to land and refuel on the return journey. Enter Kenya. Kenya's president, Jomo Kenyatta, had a significant Jewish community in his country and a trusted advisor named Bruce Mackenzie. Through quiet diplomatic channels, Kenyatta agreed to allow the Israeli planes to refuel in Nairobi, but covertly. No official acknowledgement, no public support, just a runway and fuel trucks. Without Kenya, the mission was impossible. A full-scale rehearsal was conducted. A mock-up of the terminal was built. Commandos practiced the assault. The results were, according to one officer, very bad. Timing was off. Coordination was shaky. Junior officers quietly considered recommending cancellation, but the clock was ticking. The deadline was July 4. Tamir Pardo, who would later become head of Mossad, was Yonatan Netanyahu's aide during the operation. Years later, he reflected on the preparation and admitted the odds of success were disturbingly low. The planning felt rushed, amateurish in places. Even Israel's own officers believed this mission had a low chance of success. On the 3rd of July, 1976, 4 Israeli C-130 Hercules transport planes departed from Sharm el-Sheikh. Inside the lead plane were 29 commandos from Sayeret Matkal, Israel's elite special forces unit, led by 30-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu. Also aboard, 2 Land Rovers and 1 black Mercedes sedan. The Mercedes had been hastily painted to resemble the personal vehicle of Idi Amin. This was the psychological trick, a detail often overlooked but brilliantly simple. Ugandan soldiers had been trained to stand down when Idi Amin's convoy approached. The dictator travelled with a black Mercedes and Land Rovers. Guards were conditioned not to stop him, not to question him, not to interfere. The Israeli planners knew this. If they could mimic Amin's convoy, even for a few seconds, they might buy enough time to reach the terminal before resistance began. This wasn't firepower, it was theatre. The planes flew low over the Red Sea, then over hostile territory, avoiding radar. The flight took hours. Inside, commandos sat in silence, some writing farewell letters to their families. At approximately 11 p.m. on July 3, the first C-130 descended toward Entebbe airport. No clearance had been requested. No permission given. The plane landed in darkness. The rear ramp of the C-130 dropped. The black Mercedes and Land Rovers rolled out onto the tarmac. The convoy drove toward the old terminal building. In the darkness, from a distance, it looked like Idi Amin returning from a trip. Ugandan sentries stood at the terminal entrance. As the convoy approached, one sentry moved forward, signaling them to stop. The plan called for silenced pistols. Quick, quiet kills. No noise to alert the hijackers inside, but the silenced pistols jammed. Commandos switched to rifles. Gunfire shattered the night. Surprise was partially lost. The assault team sprinted toward the terminal. Doors were blown open. Commandos poured inside, shouting in Hebrew and English for hostages to get down, to stay on the floor. Inside, the hijackers were armed and alert. Some were near the hostages. Others were positioned at the terminal's exits. Gunfire erupted. Within minutes, all 7 hijackers were dead. The speed of the assault was overwhelming, but chaos had replaced precision. Hostages were screaming. Some stood up in confusion. Commandos were shouting orders in Hebrew, a language some hostages didn't fully understand. Outside, Ugandan soldiers realized what was happening and opened fire. Bullets tore through the terminal walls. Yonatan Netanyahu was leading the evacuation when he was shot. The bullet came from the control tower, fired by a Ugandan soldier. Netanyahu fell. Commandos pulled him toward the plane, but the wound was fatal. Inside the terminal, 3 hostages were killed. Jean-Jacques Maimoni was mistaken for a terrorist in the chaos and shot. Pasco Cohen and Ida Borochevich were caught in the crossfire, likely from friendly fire. Meanwhile, other commandos were destroying Ugandan MiG fighter jets parked on the runway. Explosives detonated. Fuel tanks ignited. The night sky lit up with fire. The entire assault lasted 30 minutes. Hostages were rushed onto the waiting planes. Wounded were carried. The dead were brought aboard. Ugandan forces engaged. But the Israeli commandos held them back long enough to complete the evacuation. At 11:53 p.m., the cone 130 seconds lifted off. The full operation from landing to takeoff lasted 53 minutes. The planes flew to Nairobi, Kenya, where they refueled as arranged. Medical teams were waiting. Wounded hostages were stabilized. The body of Yonatan Netanyahu was treated with reverence. Then the planes flew home to Israel. 102 hostages were rescued. But the cost was real. 3 hostages died during the raid. 1 Israeli officer, the mission commander, was killed. 45 Ugandan soldiers were dead. 11 to 30 MiG fighter jets were destroyed. And 1 hostage, 75-year-old Dora Bloch, had been hospitalized in Kampala before the raid due to illness. She wasn't at the terminal during the rescue. When Idi Amin learned of the raid, he ordered her murder in retaliation. Ugandan intelligence officers dragged her from her hospital bed and killed her. Her body was hidden. It wasn't recovered until 1979, after the Uganda-Tanzania War, when Amin's regime finally fell. There were other costs, too. Amin retaliated against Kenya for its covert support. 245 Kenyans living in Uganda were killed. 3,000 more fled. And in 1978, Bruce Mackenzie, the Kenyan advisor who helped facilitate the mission, died when his plane exploded. Mid-flight, likely bombed on Amin's orders, Uganda executed 12 of its own soldiers for alleged cowardice during the raid. Victory came, but it was not clean. When the Israeli planes landed at Ben Gurion Airport on the morning of the 4th of July, 1976, the nation erupted. Crowds gathered. Families reunited. The impossible had happened. Over 100 hostages, alive, against all odds. The operation was initially called Operation Thunderbolt. After Yonatan Netanyahu's death, it was renamed Operation Yonatan in his honor. But the celebration was tempered by grief. Netanyahu's death became symbolic. He was the older brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, who would later become Prime Minister of Israel. The loss resonated deeply. Released hostages gave interviews describing the horror of separation, the fear of imminent execution, and the sudden chaos of rescue. Some described hearing Hebrew being shouted and realizing, in disbelief, that Israeli soldiers had somehow reached them. But not everyone returned home. Dora Bloch's family waited. For days, Uganda claimed she was alive. Then, silence. The truth wouldn't emerge for years. The international response was fractured. The United States praised the operation. President Gerald Ford personally congratulated Prime Minister Rabin. The United Kingdom and France, while more cautious publicly, privately expressed admiration. The United Nations Security Council debated the raid. Some nations condemned it as a violation of Ugandan sovereignty. Others argued it was a justified act of self-defense to save civilians from imminent execution. The debate was heated, but no formal condemnation of Israel passed. Behind closed doors, however, something else was happening. Military academies around the world quietly studied the operation. Special forces units requested briefings. Counter-terrorism doctrine began to change. The raid demonstrated that hostage rescue was possible even under the most difficult circumstances. It showed that intelligence, speed, and audacity could overcome distance and hostile terrain. In the years that followed, the operation became a case study. It influenced the creation of elite counter-terrorism units, including the United States Delta Force, which was formed partly in response to lessons learned from Entebbe. Films were made. Books were written. The story became legend, but the legend obscured the complexities. Declassified documents revealed internal disputes. Some commandos, including Muki Betsa, later claimed that Yonatan Netanyahu had fired unnecessarily at the Ugandan sentry, causing the loss of surprise. Others, including Amir Ofer and Amos Goran, argued that the sentry posed an imminent threat and that Betsa's detours during the assault caused critical delays. The accounts don't align. Trauma, chaos, and adrenaline create conflicting memories, what researchers call a Rashomon effect, where the same event is remembered differently by those who lived through it. Declassified British documents from 2007 added another layer. They contained claims, sourced from a Euro-Arab contact, that Israel's Shin Bet had allegedly orchestrated the hijacking with the PFLP to undermine PLO-French diplomatic ties and prevent a U.S. brokered peace deal that favored moderates. Israeli officials dismissed these claims as baseless conspiracy theories. No credible evidence has ever supported them. But the fact that such allegations were recorded in official documents highlights the deep suspicions and geopolitical intrigue surrounding the operation. Friendly fire incidents were acknowledged, but minimized in public accounts. The Israeli government emphasized the rescue's success, not its imperfections. Survivors like Surin Hershko, who was paralyzed during the raid, carried the physical scars. Others carried psychological ones. The myth was born, but the reality was far more human. Operation Entebbe stands as one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. But it wasn't just about commandos and gunfire. At its core, it was an intelligence operation. Mossad didn't just gather intelligence. They reconstructed an entire battlefield from fragments, blueprints from engineers who had left Uganda years earlier, testimonies from terrified hostages who had just been freed, whispers from sources across Africa. Memory, detail, and deduction. They built a map of a place they couldn't see, inside a country that wanted them dead. And when diplomacy collapsed, when negotiations failed, when the deadline approached and execution seemed inevitable, they acted. 4,000 kilometers. Hostile airspace. A dictator's army. 60 minutes to succeed or die. It wasn't perfect. 3 hostages died in the chaos. The mission commander was killed. Friendly fire marred the operation. Luck played a role, jammed silencers, the psychological trick of the Mossad, Kenya's covert cooperation. But 102 people who were moments from execution went home. The operation changed global counter-terrorism strategy. It proved that distance wasn't insurmountable, that intelligence could compensate for firepower, that audacity, when combined with precision, could achieve the impossible. It also sent a message not just to hijackers, but to the world. Israel would cross any distance, violate any border, risk any cost, to bring its people home. That message endures. Decades later, the Entebbe raid remains a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, when hostages sit on concrete floors awaiting death, when governments are paralyzed by impossible choices, when the world expects surrender, intelligence, resolve, and timing can still change history. Operation Entebbe wasn't just a rescue, it was a message that even moments before execution, intelligence, resolve, and timing can still change history.